Caleb Whitfield had 31 days before the bank took the last 40 acres of his family's farm. 2 counties away, a woman named Eleanor Hastings was already driving toward Tennessee with a folder she had been forbidden to open for 60 years. The first thing Caleb did every morning was listen. Not to the radio, not to voices, but to the particular creak of the screen door on its third hinge, the one that stuck for exactly 2 seconds before it gave way. That sound meant the day had started, and nothing had changed overnight. And for a man who had come home from 3 deployments unable to trust silence, that small mechanical groan was the closest thing he had to peace. He was 34 years old, and he had been back in the United States for 6 years, though most days it still felt like he was only visiting. He made his coffee the same way every time, black, in a dented steel cup that had traveled with him through 2 provinces he no longer let himself name out loud. He did not sleep more than 4 hours most nights. He did not go into town more than he had to, and when he did, he kept his eyes on the middle distance, past the people who used to know him, and now only nodded, careful, like he was something that might go off. His parents were both gone, his father from a stroke while Caleb was still overseas, his mother 2 winters later from what the doctor called a weakened heart, and what Caleb privately understood to be grief, with nowhere left to go. He had no siblings. He had a fiancée once, before the 2nd deployment, and a folded flag he did not have, because there had been no funeral, only a slow unraveling of a relationship that could not survive 9 months of silence, followed by a man who flinched at car doors. So he had the farm, 40 acres of hay and soybean ground in the rolling hill country outside a town called Marrow's Fork, Tennessee, population 2,000 and shrinking, and at the edge of the north pasture, an old grain silo that had not held a single bushel since before Caleb was born. The silo was the one thing on the property his grandfather had never let anyone touch. Rust-streaked, 28 feet of curved sheet metal and timber framing, condemned by the county inspector in writing 11 years earlier, with a sign wired to the door that said, "Do not enter in county-issued orange." Caleb's grandfather used to sit on an overturned bucket near its base some evenings, not working, just sitting, looking up at it the way other men looked at church steeples. He never explained why. He died when Caleb was 9, and the silo had simply stood there ever since, patient and useless, while the rest of the farm changed hands and purposes around it. On a Tuesday in early March, with the bank's letter sitting unopened on his kitchen table for 4 days, Caleb walked out to the silo with a pry bar and no plan beyond needing something, anything, to put his hands on. He told himself it was practical. Salvage the metal, clear the ground, maybe get the land assessed for more without a condemned structure dragging down the value. That was the story he told himself. The truth, which he did not say out loud to anyone, was that he needed a fight he might actually be able to win. Word had gotten around Marrow's Fork before Caleb had even pulled the county sign off the door. That was how the town worked. Sheriff's Deputy Danny Ossie saw the truck parked by the silo on his morning drive-by and mentioned it to the gas station clerk, who mentioned it to 3 customers by lunch. By the time Caleb drove into town for lag bolts and a new grinder blade, the hardware store owner, a heavy-set man named Russ Calloway, who had known Caleb's father, was already shaking his head before Caleb reached the counter. "Heard you're messing with that old silo," Russ said. "County condemned that thing back when your granddad was still walking around. You know that, right?" "I know," Caleb said. "Structure like that, 20-some feet up, rusted through in half a dozen places probably. That's not a hobby, son. That's a hospital bill." Caleb paid for the bolts and did not answer. It was not the last time he would hear some version of that conversation. Over the following 2 weeks, half the town seemed to develop an opinion about a silo none of them had thought about in a decade. Some called it grief, dressed up as home improvement. Some called it dangerous and meant it kindly. A few, mostly the ones who had gone to high school with Caleb before he enlisted and had watched him come back changed, called it something else, something they said only to each other and never to his face, that the war had left something loose in him. And now he was up on a rickety catwalk at dawn instead of getting help like a normal person. None of it stopped him. If anything, it gave the work a shape he could hold on to. Each morning he drove out to the north pasture before the sun cleared the ridge, and he worked until his hands stopped answering him properly. He scraped rust down to bare metal in sections, patched what could be patched, and began, board by board, tearing out the rotted interior cladding that lined the silo's inner wall. It was slow, solitary, unglamorous work, and that was exactly what he wanted. Nobody expected anything from a man scraping rust. Nobody needed him to explain himself, to perform recovery, to sit across from a counselor, and describe things he still could not find language for. Out here, the only conversation was between his hands and the metal never asked him anything he could not answer. The bank's second letter arrived on a Thursday. 90 days to bring the mortgage current, or the county would begin foreclosure proceedings on the remaining acreage, the letter said, in the flat, bureaucratic language that made a man's entire life sound like a line item. Caleb read it twice at the kitchen table, then folded it into the drawer with the first one, and went back out to the silo before he had eaten breakfast. He did not have a plan for the money. He barely had a plan for the day. What he had was a structure that needed him in a very literal, very physical way. And for a man who had spent 6 years feeling like nothing needed him at all, that was enough to get him through one more morning. By the second week, he had cleared the ground floor entirely and moved up into the mid-level catwalk, checking the bolts that held the old ladder rungs to the inner wall. That was when he first noticed it, a section of the interior sheathing, roughly waist height, that sounded wrong when he knocked on it. Not the dull, solid thud of wood against packed grain residue and stone foundation. A hollow answer, a gap behind it. He didn't think much of it that day. Old structures settled, shifted, left air pockets behind rotted boards all the time. He made a note in the small spiral notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, the same notebook where he tracked material costs and hours, and moved on to securing the section above it before the light went. But what he did not know yet, what nobody in Marrow's Fork knew, including the woman who had been driving toward the state for 2 days by then, was that the silo's inner wall was not one wall at all. It was two, built 18 inches apart, and the space between them had been carrying a secret for longer than the town itself had a name. The obstacles came from 2 directions that spring, and neither of them cared about the other. The first was the county. A letter from the Building and Safety Office arrived less than 3 weeks after Caleb pulled the condemned sign off the door, informing him that any renovation work on a structure with an active condemnation order required a permit, an engineering assessment, and, buried in paragraph 4, in the kind of language designed to end a project before it began, a fee schedule that started at $2,200 and climbed depending on square footage and structural classification. Caleb sat in the county office 2 days later across from a clerk named Patricia Voss, who was not unkind, only tired, and who explained more than once that she did not make the rules, she only enforced them, and that structures deemed a public hazard could be ordered demolished regardless of the owner's wishes if repairs were not documented and approved within a set window. "I don't have $2,200, Caleb told her, which was true, and which he had not said out loud to anyone until that moment. "Then I'd strongly recommend you stop working on it," Patricia said, not unkindly, "before somebody drives by, sees you up on that catwalk, and calls it in as a safety concern. Once that happens, it's out of your hands." He left without an engineer, without a permit, and without an answer, and he kept working anyway, more carefully now, aware that every truck that slowed down on the county road past his property might be someone with a phone in their hand and the building and safety office's number saved in it. The second obstacle was closer to home and harder to argue with because it came wearing a familiar face. His mother's younger brother, Uncle Ray Whitfield, drove up from Chattanooga on a Saturday, uninvited, and stood at the base of the silo with his arms crossed, watching Caleb work the way a man watches a mistake he already knows the ending to. "You're about to lose the whole farm, and you're up there polishing a grain bin nobody's used since before I could drive," Ray said. "You understand how that looks, Caleb? People in town are already saying things. Let them say things. I'm not people in town. I'm your mother's brother. And I'm telling you, this isn't honoring your granddad. This is hiding from the bank. You want my help? I know a realtor who can move that back 40 before the foreclosure clock runs out. Get you square. Get you a fresh start somewhere that doesn't have 30 years of ghosts on it." Caleb didn't answer right away. He climbed down from the catwalk, wiped his hands on a rag, and for a moment Ray thought he'd gotten through. Then Caleb said quietly, "I've spent 6 years being told the smart move was to walk away from things I didn't understand yet. I'm not doing that again." Ray left an hour later and did not come back that spring, though the words stayed, uninvited, the way family words do. Ray's visit was not the last complication that week. 2 days later, a county safety inspector named Warren Fitch showed up unannounced at the gate, clipboard in hand, saying only that his office had received a call about unauthorized work on a condemned structure. He would not say who had called, though Caleb had his suspicions, and it did not much matter. The effect was the same either way. Fitch walked the perimeter of the silo, noted the missing county sign, noted the visible scaffolding Caleb had rigged along the exterior, and told him, not unkindly but without room for negotiation, that any further work without an approved permit could result in a formal cease and desist order, and that a second violation on top of an active condemnation could accelerate the county's authority to demolish the structure outright, mortgage troubles or not. Caleb stood in his own pasture and listened to a stranger describe, in flat procedural language, how easily the thing he'd poured 6 weeks of himself into could simply be taken out of his hands entirely by people who had never climbed a single rung of that ladder. He said nothing he would later regret, which for a man who had spent years being told his temper was a liability, felt like its own small victory. He signed the notice Fitch handed him, watched the truck pull back out onto the county road, and stood alone in the quiet afterward, aware that the clock on his mortgage and the clock on this new warning were now running at the same time, side by side, neither one waiting for the other. It was in the wake of that conversation, 3 days later, alone at dusk with the mid-level catwalk, lit by a single work lamp clipped to the rail, that Caleb finally pried loose the hollow-sounding section of inner sheathing he'd noted weeks before. What came away in his hands wasn't rotted board. It was a deliberately fitted panel, tongue and groove, held by square iron nails that predated anything else in the structure by what looked like a century behind it. Not open air, not a settling gap, but a narrow cavity running the full curve of the silo wall, floored with old cedar planking, and along that floor, half buried in decades of dust, the corner of something rectangular. Fabric, maybe, or leather? He did not touch it that night. He stood there with the work lamp swinging slightly on its clip, the cavity breathing cold, mineral air into his face, and felt something he had not felt in longer than he could easily remember. Not dread, not the flat gray static that usually filled him after dark, but a kind of alertness that felt almost like curiosity. He climbed down, locked the gate at the pasture fence out of habit, though there was nothing out here worth stealing, and drove back to the house without eating dinner. 2 days after that, a second obstacle folded itself quietly into the first, though Caleb didn't yet understand the two were connected. A woman he had never met called the farm's landline, a number almost nobody used anymore, asking whether the property still belonged to the Whitfield family, and whether there was, by any chance, an old grain silo still standing on the north end. Caleb, guarded, gave her nothing beyond a confirmation that yes, there was, and no, he wasn't interested in selling. The woman, who gave her name only as Eleanor, said she wasn't calling about selling anything, and that she would very much like to speak with him in person if he'd allow it. Caleb, who had spent 6 years turning away every unexpected voice on the phone, almost hung up. Almost. Something in the woman's voice, careful, deliberate, like she was reciting a sentence she had rehearsed for years, made him give her a date instead. He told himself it was curiosity about the cavity in the wall and nothing more. But it was the first time since coming home that Caleb Whitfield had agreed to let a stranger onto his land, and even he noticed that. That same week, Warren Fitch's cease and desist notice worked its way through the county system, and a formal letter arrived giving Caleb 10 business days to halt all work, pending inspection or face escalation to a demolition review. He read it standing at the kitchen counter, the bank's letters still folded in the drawer beside it, and understood plainly that he now had 2 separate government processes, converging on the same piece of land from 2 different directions, each one indifferent to the other, each one running on its own clock. He did not know yet that a phone call from a woman with a folder full of photocopies was about to become the only thing capable of slowing either of them down. Eleanor Hastings arrived on a Sunday morning, 71 years old, silver-haired, driving a car with Ohio plates and a folder on the passenger seat that she carried against her chest, like it weighed considerably more than paper. She stood at the base of the silo for a long moment before she said anything, looking up at it the same unreadable way Caleb's grandfather used to. "My grandmother grew up not far from here," she said finally. "She used to tell a story about this land, about a silo with 2 walls. I always thought it was something she made up to keep us entertained. I only found out 3 months ago that it wasn't." She opened the folder. Inside were photocopies, a handwritten letter, brittle and water-stained in the original, dated 1858, a page from a church ledger, a newspaper clipping from a county historical society newsletter published decades ago that Caleb had never seen. Eleanor explained carefully that her family's oral history traced back to a woman named Adeline, born enslaved in Kentucky, who had passed through this part of Tennessee sometime in the late 1850s on a route north, and who had spoken, later in life, of a hollow granary, where she and others had waited 2 nights for a signal before moving on. Eleanor's family had treated it as legend for 4 generations. Then, a distant cousin, doing genealogical research, had found the letter, written by a farmer's wife, coded in domestic language about extra grain storage and guests who eat little and leave quietly. That named this exact stretch of the county. "I'm not asking you for anything," Eleanor said. "I drove 2 days because I needed to see if the story was true before I got too old to make the trip. That's all." Caleb didn't answer right away. He thought about the cavity behind the sheathing, the cedar planking, the rectangular shape half buried in dust that he still hadn't touched. He thought about his grandfather sitting on that overturned bucket every evening, looking up at the silo like it was something to be guarded rather than used. "I think I found something," he said. "3 days ago. I didn't know what it was." He walked her to the base of the ladder, and for the first time since he'd started the work, Caleb Whitfield climbed up to the mid-level catwalk, with someone else close behind him. An unbearable, unfamiliar thing. Another person's breathing near his own in an enclosed space, and he made himself do it anyway. Together, by flashlight, they looked into the hollow between the two walls. Eleanor made a sound that wasn't quite a word, the rectangular shape in the dust. When Caleb finally lifted it free with careful hands, turned out to be a small leather satchel, cracked and stiffened with age, stitched shut along one seam by hand. Neither of them opened it that day. What they had was not yet an answer. It was only the first piece of one, a name, a possibility, a hollow space where a town's entire understanding of itself was about to shift a few careful inches. Whatever was inside that satchel would have to wait one more night, because Eleanor Hastings insisted, gently but firmly, that if this was what she thought it was, it deserved to be opened properly, with someone from the State Historical Office present, not alone in a condemned silo by flashlight. Caleb agreed. But that night, for the first time in 6 years, he found himself unable to sleep for a reason that had nothing to do with the war. What Caleb had assumed would be a quiet, private discovery became, within a week, something considerably larger and harder to control. Eleanor made 2 phone calls before she left Marrow's Fork. One to a historic preservation officer with the Tennessee Historical Commission, a measured, precise woman named Dr. Naomi Rourke, and one to the genealogist's cousin, who had first found the coded letter. Within 10 days, Dr. Rourke was standing in Caleb's north pasture with a small team, cotton gloves, acid-free document sleeves, and a manner that made clear this was no longer simply Caleb's silo to do with as he pleased. As the satchel, opened under controlled conditions in a folding tent erected beside the structure, contained 3 items that would eventually change how the county understood its own history. A hand-stitched cloth map marking a chain of safe points running north from the Alabama line through Tennessee and into Kentucky. A small tin containing a lock of hair and a folded scrap of fabric, likely a keepsake carried by someone who never returned to claim it. And a second letter, this one unsigned, referencing the granary at Whitfield's place by name. Dr. Rourke was cautiously electric about the find, calling it, in careful academic language, one of the more intact physical corroborations of oral Underground Railroad history documented in this region in the last 2 decades. But she was equally clear about what came next, and it was not simple. The silo could not remain a private hobby project. If Caleb wanted to preserve what he'd found rather than see it quietly cataloged and hauled away to a climate-controlled archive 3 hours from here, he would need to formally partner with the Historical Commission, submit to a full structural and archaeological assessment, and, this was the part that made Caleb's stomach tighten, likely open the site, eventually, to public visitation and oversight. His condemned silo, and the trauma-quiet solitude he had built around it, was about to become the opposite of solitary. His first instinct was to refuse. He told Dr. Rourke, politely but flatly, that he'd found the satchel. He'd notify whoever needed notifying, but he had no interest in turning his family's back pasture into a tourist stop. "I didn't do this for an audience," he said. Dr. Rourke, to her credit, didn't argue with him. She simply left him a stack of documentation and a business card, and told him the offer would stand for as long as the foreclosure clock allowed, because after that, the county could seize and dispose of the structure however it saw fit, artifacts included, and there would be nothing anyone, her, Eleanor, or Caleb, could do about it. That was the sentence that changed things. Not the historical significance, not the letters or the map, the blunt fact that if he lost the farm, he lost this too, lost the chance to be the one who decided what happened to it, lost even the right to stand in that pasture and look up at the thing his grandfather had spent 30 years quietly guarding without ever explaining why. So Caleb tried the first thing he knew how to try. He went back to the county building and safety office, folder of historical documentation in hand, and asked Patricia Voss whether a structure of confirmed historical significance changed anything about the condemnation timeline. It did, technically. State law allowed a temporary stay on demolition orders for sites under active historical review. But the stay required a formal nomination to the Commission's register, a process that could take 4 to 6 months, and Caleb's mortgage clock was measured in weeks, not months. Patricia gave him what sympathy she could, and a stack of forms, and told him that paperwork alone wouldn't stop a bank. His second attempt was harder and stranger for a man who had spent 6 years avoiding rooms full of people. Dr. Rourke mentioned, almost in passing, that emergency preservation grants existed for exactly this kind of situation. Sites at risk of loss before formal review could be completed, but that the application required a public hearing before the County Historical Advisory Board, an actual room, an actual audience. Caleb standing up and explaining out loud in front of people who had spent weeks whispering about the veteran wasting his time on a condemned silo, why any of this mattered. His first attempt at preparing for that hearing failed almost immediately. Dr. Rourke had suggested he write out formal remarks, cite the documentation, keep it professional and brief, and Caleb tried, sitting at his kitchen table for 2 nights running with a legal pad and a pen, drafting sentences about historical significance and preservation value that sounded, when he read them back out loud to the empty kitchen, like they belonged to someone else entirely. He crumpled the second draft on the third night and sat there a long while, the leftover static of the day pressing in around him, wondering whether he had it in him at all to stand in a room full of people who'd spent the spring quietly deciding what kind of man he was. His second attempt worked, though it did not look like an attempt at all. 2 nights before the hearing, Eleanor called, not to check on the paperwork, but simply to ask how he was holding up. He found himself, without quite planning to, telling her about his grandfather on the overturned bucket, about the flag he never got to fold, about the 2 seconds the screen door stuck before it gave way each morning. She didn't interrupt him once. When he finally stopped talking, she said only, "That's the speech. You don't need the other one." He hadn't been trying to write a speech, but somewhere in that unplanned, unguarded conversation, he found the only version of the truth simple enough to survive being said out loud to strangers. He almost didn't go anyway. The morning of the hearing, he sat in his truck in the county building parking lot for 11 minutes, hands on the wheel, doing the breathing exercises a VA counselor had taught him 2 years ago and that he'd never once actually used until that moment. Uncle Ray was there, in the back row, arms crossed, the same posture as the day at the silo. Russ Calloway was there, too, and 6 people who had made comments about Caleb behind his back all spring. Caleb stood up anyway. He didn't have notes. He talked about the hollow wall, about Adeline's story passed down through Eleanor's family for 4 generations, before anyone believed it, about his grandfather sitting on a bucket every evening, not working, just watching, guarding something he probably knew about and never had the words, or maybe never had the safety to explain to anyone. He talked briefly about coming home from 3 deployments to a country that expected him to simply resume being a person, and about the strange, specific relief of putting his hands on something broken that he could actually physically fix. He did not perform grief. He simply told the truth, plainly, the way he'd learned to report facts in briefings that had nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with what was true. When he sat back down, the room was quiet in a way it hadn't been before he stood up. The board approved the emergency grant application 17 days later. Not the full funding Caleb needed to save the farm outright, but enough, combined with a preservation easement, the commission offered on the silo parcel specifically to halt the foreclosure proceedings on that section of land and buy him the time the historical nomination required. It was not a clean win. He still lost 11 of his 40 acres in a negotiated settlement with the bank on the remaining ground, a fact that sat heavy in his chest for days afterward, a reminder that even a story with a good ending sometimes costs something real on the way there. But the silo, and the ground immediately around it, was his, protected now not by luck, but by the true weight of what it had once meant to people whose names history had nearly swallowed whole. There was one more night, near the end of that stretch, when Caleb almost walked away from all of it anyway. Alone in the pasture after the grant news, staring up at the silo in the dark, he felt the old flat gray static creeping back in. The sense that none of this, the hearing, the standing up in front of a room, the letting strangers onto his land, was really him, that he'd overextended into a version of himself he couldn't sustain. He sat on the same overturned bucket his grandfather used to use, hands shaking slightly, and for nearly an hour he did not move. What brought him back, in the end, wasn't a plan or a strategy. It was simply the shape of the silo against the stars, patient the way it had always been, having waited 160 years to be understood. And Caleb realized, sitting there, that he could give it a little more time too, and without quite meaning to, give himself some as well. The formal designation came through 14 months later, in late spring. A plain envelope from the Tennessee Historical Commission confirming that the Whitfield Silo hiding chamber had been added to the State Historical Register, with a joint marker to be placed at the property line, acknowledging both its agricultural history and its documented role in the Underground Railroad. By then, the site looked almost nothing like the rusted, condemned structure Caleb had first climbed into, with nothing but a pry bar and a need to put his hands on something. The exterior had been stabilized and repainted under Dr. Rourke's team's supervision, careful to preserve the original sheet metal wherever the steel could be saved rather than replaced. The interior cavity between the 2 walls had been left largely as it was found, protected now behind reinforced glass. The cedar planking and the space where the satchel had lain preserved exactly as Adeline and the others who passed through it might have known it. Eleanor Hastings came back for the unveiling of the marker, 72 now, and stood at the base of the silo the same way she had the first time, looking up. This time, she wasn't alone. She'd brought her granddaughter, 17 years old, who had grown up hearing the story as legend the way Eleanor once had, and who now stood reading the bronze plaque with her own eyes, watching a family story become verified history in real time. Eleanor took Caleb's hand before the ceremony began and told him, quietly, that whatever her ancestor Adeline had felt waiting in that hollow wall 160 years earlier, she hoped it had been something close to what Eleanor felt now, standing in the same spot in daylight, watched over instead of hidden. Caleb didn't have a response ready for that. He only nodded and found that some things didn't need an answer, only a witness. Dr. Rourke's team, over the following months, had also traced enough of the coded letters to confirm at least 2 other names connected to the route through Marrow's Fork, travelers whose full stories were still incomplete, but whose existence was no longer a matter of dispute. A small display case near the silo's entrance now held photographs of the original documents. The cloth map reproduced beside a modern county survey, so visitors could trace, mile for mile, the same ground those travelers had once crossed on foot, in the dark, trusting a hollow wall and a farmer's wife's careful, coded language to keep them alive one more night. Marrow's fork changed too in the smaller, slower way small towns change. Russ Calloway, who had once told Caleb a rusted silo was a hospital bill waiting to happen, was among the first to ask if the Historical Society needed volunteers for the visitor days. Uncle Ray drove up from Chattanooga a second time, this time without an opinion about realtors, and stood quietly at the back of the small crowd during the unveiling, and afterward, without much ceremony, told Caleb he was sorry for pushing him to sell. Caleb accepted it the way he'd learned to accept most things that spring, plainly, without needing it to be more than it was. The silo now welcomed visitors twice a month, guided tours arranged through the County Historical Society, and it was Caleb, awkward at first, then steadier with practice, who led most of them. He told Adeline's story the way Eleanor had first told it to him, carefully, without embellishment, letting the facts carry the weight they deserved, rather than performing emotion he didn't need to manufacture. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that standing in front of a dozen strangers explaining the history of the hollow wall was easier than he'd expected. Easier, in fact, than most ordinary conversations had been for him in 6 years, because this, unlike small talk, had a clear shape and a true center, and nobody in that room was waiting for him to be fine. They were there for the silo, and the silo, in turn, gave him somewhere to stand. On the morning of the marker unveiling, before the crowd arrived, Caleb walked out to the pasture alone the way he had almost every morning for over a year now. The screen door on the farmhouse still stuck for exactly 2 seconds on its third hinge before it gave way, and he still listened for it every time, the same small anchor it had always been. But the silence after it no longer felt like something he had to survive. He climbed the ladder one more time before the visitors came, up past the reinforced glass over the hollow wall, up to the very top of the catwalk, where his grandfather, he now understood, must have climbed decades earlier and looked out over the same 40, now 29, acres of Tennessee Hill country his family had held for 3 generations. He understood, finally, why his grandfather used to sit at the base of this silo every evening, saying nothing, guarding something he never explained. The old man hadn't been protecting a secret out of fear. He'd been keeping faith with it, quietly, the only way he knew how, waiting, maybe without even admitting it to himself, for someone to come along who needed to find it as badly as it needed to be found. Caleb climbed back down as the first cars started arriving at the gate. He wiped the rust dust from his hands onto his jeans, the same motion he'd made every morning for over a year, and walked out to meet them. Not as the recluse Marrow's fork had once quietly worried about, but as the man who had rebuilt something nobody else believed was worth saving, and in doing so had found the one thing 6 years of silence had never been able to give him back on its own, a reason, each morning, to walk toward people instead of away from them. Later that afternoon, after the crowd had thinned and the folding chairs had been stacked away, Caleb stood alone for a few minutes at the base of the silo, in the exact spot where his grandfather's overturned bucket used to sit. He didn't sit down. He just looked up, the way the old man used to, and for the first time understood the gesture completely, not waiting, not guarding out of fear, but simply keeping company with something that mattered for as long as it took. Somewhere behind him, The screen door on the farmhouse creaked on its third hinge, caught for 2 seconds, and gave way, and Caleb, without turning around, smiled at a sound that had once meant only survival, and now, finally, meant home.